Tonight is a particular pleasure to welcome all of the supporters of Asia Week New York that officially kicks off tomorrow. While many participating New York galleries are open by appointment, as are the auction houses, most of you will be making virtual visits to Asia Week via your computers to view the wonderful works being offered by the leading Asian art dealers from around the globe. Hopefully, we will be able to again celebrate Asian art as one in September and certainly a year from now. We look forward to that. After years of preparation, it is especially frustrating to be presenting this important exhibition of ceramics that all demand to be held, to be touched, but now must be enjoyed on this virtual platform and through our virtual exhibition catalog. It is the first exhibition in the United States in over a half a century focusing on Rosanjin. I do hope that at least some of you will be able to come to New York City to see the show in person, as it truly merits such a journey. The digital catalog of the entire show is already available online, and soon we will also have a video tour of the show available. But this exhibit, more than any show that I have organized in the past, begs for viewing in person in 360 degrees and for individual handling to truly appreciate the artistry, the balance, the creativity, and functionality of each work. Hopefully, most or at least some of you were fortunate to see Louise Cort's exhibition at the Sackler, or Japan Society, in 2003. Titled Isamu Noguchi and Modern Japanese Ceramics, A Close Embrace of the Earth. An incredibly important exhibition and publication, it remains nearly 2 decades following that, the principal resource in English on this seminal period in the development of Japanese modern clay art. In many ways, that exhibition and publication were an inspiration for my endeavor here. So an enormous thank you to Louise for paving the way. Additionally, I must offer my deepest thanks to the Kuroda family of Tokyo. None of this would have been remotely feasible, especially in this period of zero travel, without the cooperation of my marvelous colleagues, Kuroda Koji and his father, Kusaomi of Shibuya Kuroda Toen. I remain profoundly indebted to their perseverance, insights, and support, and trust in me, never more profoundly than this year. So it is my plan tonight to try to reveal and capture for you the mystery, the legend, the beauty, and the context of the work and lives of the celebrated figure Kitaōji Rosanjin and his band of rival ceramists. We have a marvelous panel of these 5 experts who will do just that, calling in from Ohio, North Carolina, Tokyo, and New York, a true silver lining for these days of life lived on a computer. I will introduce each of them ahead of their first question, but with such an array of experts and so many insights to offer, tonight's panel will surely run close to 90 minutes. So I ask all of you to be sure to have refills of your favorite libation close at hand so you don't miss a word. So my first question will be for Morgan. And let me introduce Morgan to you. Morgan Pitelka is the professor and chair of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is also a professor in the history department and the co-editor of the Journal of Japanese Studies. Morgan's scholarship focuses on the history of late medieval and early modern Japan, with particular interest in the samurai, tea culture, ceramics, cities, and material culture. His newest book, Reading Medieval Ruins from 16th Century Japan, Material History of Urban Life and Destruction, is forthcoming this year from Cambridge University Press. He speaks regularly on Japanese history and culture to audiences and has given talks across the United States, Europe, and Asia. Morgan serves on the American Advisory Committee of the Japan Foundation and the advisory boards of several nonprofit and educational organizations. So Morgan, my first question to you is that Rosanjin is well known for making a dazzling diversity of shapes of ceramics using different traditional styles. How did the Japanese tradition of using many different types of ceramic serving dishes develop in the pre-modern era? And why is there such a strong focus on the special qualities of different clay bodies? Morgan?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joan, and welcome to everyone on the call today. I'm going to be providing a deep kind of prehistory for Rosanjin in some ways, and this is coming directly from my current research and the book that Joan mentioned, Reading Medieval Ruins, which is about a city from the 16th century in Japan that was destroyed in the civil wars of that era, and the incredible archaeological evidence from that city. And the reason I want to try to address the origins of the ceramic diversity of traditional Japanese clay arts in this way is to really highlight that what Rosanjin did in his selection of different types of shapes and different types of glazes and his mastery of so many styles was create a remarkable kind of table of contents of Japanese ceramic history that is really unprecedented and in many ways never repeated. A lot of the work that I've been doing is about ceramics, even though I mask it by saying it's about tea culture or about the samurai or about cities. I'm a potter and the son of a potter. I've been breathing clay dust, unfortunately, my entire life, and it's really my main passion and interest. The document that you see on the screen is a copy of, or not a copy, it's a version of what's called the Manual of the Attendant of the Shogunal Collection, or the Kundaikan Sochoki. And this was one of the most important documents ever written in the history of tea and ceramics in Japan, from the medieval period when the Ashikaga shoguns, the warrior leaders of Japan, were obsessed with acquiring beautiful Chinese art. And this manual was written by some of the urban commoner attendants who were essentially curators. They were collectors, they were art lovers who helped the warrior elites deploy Chinese art for ritual, social, and cultural gatherings. This is part of what I've been studying, what I'm interested in, because I think the origins of many of the special characteristics of Japanese ceramics come from this, this prehistory in warrior culture. So the family and the city that I'm studying, the city is called Ichijōdani and the family is the Asakura warlords, had a copy of this document that had been handwritten for them that they used to put on warrior ritual gatherings in the city of Ichijōdani in the 16th century. So 4 centuries before the period of time that we're most interested in for this call. Could I see the next slide, please? This is a piece excavated from the city. Again, this is a city that was destroyed in the civil wars of the 16th century. So the piece was broken and only sherds were excavated, but it was reassembled by archaeologists. And it's a beautiful example of Chinese celadons. So one of the things we learn from looking at archaeological sites from late medieval Japan is that Chinese ceramics, and to a lesser extent Korean ceramics, were widespread in late medieval Japan. So elites like the Asakura warlords used Chinese ceramics in a range of contexts, tea ceremonies and even religious rituals on the one hand, but also everyday banquets, what are called onari, which means a visiting ceremony when you greet a guest from afar. All kinds of rituals use Chinese ceramics. Can I see the next slide, please? Here is a beautiful example of blue and white Ming Dynasty porcelain called sometsuke or a jingdajun blue and white porcelain. This type of ware is also commonly found not in huge numbers, but in the residents of the Asakura, but also in urban commoner residents. And you may wonder, where did these Chinese ceramics come from? We're not talking about Kyoto here. We're talking about a city in what is now Fukui Prefecture, relatively isolated, relatively provincial. The answer is that there were Chinese merchants who lived in the city who shipped goods in and out of Ichijodani. And so part of what my research is about is showing that even in the medieval period, Japan was deeply connected to the Asian continent, and that the flow of material culture, the flow of ceramics between China, Japan, and Korea was robust. Can I see the next slide, please? We also, however, have amazing domestic ceramic traditions in Ichijodani. And this is an excavated plate that is made in the kilns located not 20, 30 miles from Ichijodani, which is in the Echizen ceramic tradition. This is one of the many natural ash glazed, or what we might call wood-fired ceramic traditions of Japan. And these types of wares, as you know, from the beautiful Bizen style and Shigaraki style ceramics that modern Japanese potters have made famous all over the world, these types of wares are all about the clay, because the natural patterns of ash glaze from the conditions of the kiln create an incredible interplay between the artistry of the potter and the environment of the kiln and the firing. And can I get the last slide, please? So another product that comes from Ichijodani is the famous Echizen jar. These are storage jars that were originally produced for entirely utilitarian reasons, but that came to be celebrated in the tea tradition and had a huge influence on modern potters, including Rosanjin. You may be more familiar with jars from Bizen and Shigaraki, but the Echizen ceramic tradition has a wonderful range of different styles of firing, different patterns of ash glaze. And many of these jars were excavated in the city of Ichijodani. So for me, the point I want to emphasize here is that from very early on in Japanese history, so my research is in the 16th century, we see that elites are drawing on Chinese ceramics, to a lesser extent Korean ceramics, and intermixing them with domestic wares, especially the natural ash glazed traditions that really bring out the power of the clay, but that we also find this same diversity of styles in urban commoner residents. And so this is even more pronounced during the Edo period, when, as a result of the flowering of new kilns across Japan, new ceramic shops in cities like Kyoto and Edo, and the spread of the tea schools, people become devoted to the acquisition of ceramics and the use of them for food and for tea purposes. But this tradition, I think, goes all the way back to the warrior rituals of the late medieval period. So part of the genius of Rosanjin, part of what I think we need to try to understand, is how he's picking and choosing objects and styles from this 400, 500-year tradition in Japan in distinctively individual and modern ways. I haven't even gotten into the food. We have all kinds of food products excavated from Ichijodani. We know what kind of fish they ate off their blue and white Ming porcelain plates, and I'd love to talk about that later if people are interested. But I think for now, at the very least, that gives you a good sense of the range of ceramic possibilities from the pre-modern period that Rosanjin and other modern potters had to draw from.
Thank you, Morgan. That was the perfect way to start us on our merry path. And as the audience will see, we will see blue and white porcelain, we will see kitchenware, and we will see vessels that look remarkably like this Echizen tsubo made by Rosanjin. Thank you very much. My next question is for Louise. Louise, during her tenure as the curator of Asian ceramics at the Freer-Sackler Galleries at the Smithsonian, she authored the Shigaraki Potter's Valley, the Noguchi publication we mentioned earlier, Seto and Mino Ceramics, and with Andy Watsky, she prepared the book and exhibition Chigusa and the Art of Tea. Among countless articles, she is the author of the insightful essay in Soaring Voices, Contemporary Japanese Women's Ceramic Artists. In 2012, and most especially appropriate for tonight, Louise was awarded the Koyama Fujio Memorial Prize for her research on historical and contemporary Japanese ceramics and the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award. And she is hard at work on a new publication together with other friends of this gallery, Halsey and Alice North, on contemporary Japanese ceramics that is due out next year. We're anxiously awaiting its publication. So Louise, my question to you. Rosanjin is a legendary figure who truly needs no introduction in Japan, but it was also not unknown in the United States either. His larger-than-life persona was a large part of the reputation that preceded him. And the man himself is inextricably intertwined with the bold and daring works he created. So can you give us a brief biography of Rosanjin and his rise to fame? And what is the real basis for the legend of Rosanjin?
Thank you, Joan. Here we have Rosanjin at the age of 70 in 1952, an image taken within the valley in Kitakamakura, where he created a compound of ceramic workers and places for having food and looking at ceramics, part and parcel of his legend that he created himself. And it's of interest in particular that this photograph was taken by Isamu Noguchi, the American sculptor who lived with Rosanjin for a year or so and worked with Rosanjin's repertory of clay and glazes, worked with Rosanjin's workshop assistants to make his own ceramics. When Joan posed the question to me earlier on in advance, I spent a lot of time looking at this image of Rosanjin, trying to pierce the singular mask that he presents to us. He has a fascinating face that refuses to yield all of its secrets, but I see in him a kind of hunger, a kind of loneliness, melancholy, a kind of wariness, and at the same time, a kind of calculation, a complicated person certainly to meet in person. Around this time, Rosanjin began publishing a magazine to publicize his activities, and he called it Doppo, which means walking alone. And it's this sense of being a loner that prevails in the story of Rosanjin's career. And yet, at the same time, what is true is that he surrounded himself in a very calculated way with people who were key to his success, his patrons, in a word. So I see Rosanjin as an impresario, as a kind of entrepreneur who throughout his lifetime created magnets of various forms for drawing people in to create sales of his ceramics. It's amazing to hear that it's estimated that he produced somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 works in his lifetime. He had a ferocious appetite to make and sell ceramics. Next slide, please. But his first known sense of attraction to an art form was to the paintings of the Nihonga artist Takeuchi Seiho, whose work at the age of 12, Rosanjin saw in a public exhibition in Kyoto. And this inspired him a desire to study painting, but his adopted father refused and insisted that he continue working in the family workshop, which produced, which carved wood blocks for painting and shop signs. So Rosanjin, next please. Rosanjin taught himself calligraphy and seal carving. And it was this skill of calligraphy in particular that gave him entree into a world that was critical for his lifetime success. This was the world of elite merchants and businessmen in cities like Kyoto, Osaka, Kanazawa, Tokyo, who had cultural interests and cultural aspirations, and who offered patronage to people like Rosanjin, inviting such people into their homes, subsidizing their living activities, and giving them access to a world of very high level connoisseurship. So next, please. It was this early patronage that led Rosanjin into the world of ceramics. And in 19, we know that he left Kyoto, went to Tokyo, opened a shop for selling and appraising antique ceramics, including the kinds of ceramics that Morgan just showed us. And within a few years, he had developed a reputation for serving meals on his antique ceramics in a room above his shop in Kyobashi. And this created a fascination for visits to Rosanjin's shop among the Tokyo intelligentsia. Within just a very few years, though, Rosanjin moved on to open a restaurant and gallery within the well-established restaurant called Hoshigaoka in Akasaka, Tokyo. This was an amazing place and highly successful for doing what Rosanjin was trying to do. It was a members club. One could not just walk in, one had to be invited or to join. And it offered settings for tea ceremony and, of course, for meals overseen by Rosanjin as the head chef. In preparation for establishing the Hoshigaoka Club, Rosanjin opened his workshop in the Kita Kamakura compound and built a kiln there with the help from kiln specialists who he knew through his contact with other potters. And he also built there a gallery to show his work. But the Kita Kamakura compound is a remarkable place where Rosanjin then lived and worked and entertained and mesmerized, worked his magic for 30 years. As you can see, it had a rural ambiance, but Rosanjin gathered into this secluded valley a total of 22 different buildings. It was kind of a fantasy land or a Williamsburg or a Sturbridge village in Japan, bringing together samples of rural architecture. But at the center was Rosanjin's busy workshop with multiple kiln specialists and ceramic specialists operating a total of 5 kilns. There were meals to be had and beer to be had in abundance. Rosanjin was famous for his love of beer. There was a museum, several buildings of museum displays, and in particular shard displays, which showed the shards that Rosanjin gathered from rural kiln sites, which were beginning to give insight to Japanese collectors and dealers into the production of ceramics from the 16th, 17th centuries, the ceramics that would become models for what Rosanjin produced. He had his own exhibitions in this space. He published, as I mentioned, magazines to alert people to what was going on, to draw them in to see. And he even invited the sculptor Isamu Noguchi and his famous movie star bride, Yamaguchi Yoshiko, to live there for a year. And I can't help but thinking that he knew that the chance to meet these two personalities would be a big attraction to the people who like to visit him there. So let's look again at this image. In the background is the thatched farmhouse, but Rosanjin is not dressed as a farmer the way some potters who were his contemporaries chose to do. He's wearing a very nice sweater, a tweed jacket, elegant horn-rimmed glasses. He's really dressed as the host for the patrons, wealthy entrepreneurs who would come to visit him here, enjoy all that he had to offer by his ceramics. And I'll close looking at this image of Rosanjin when Isamu Noguchi knew him by quoting Isamu Noguchi about Rosanjin, that he was a man of wit who dispenses insults and laughter as casually as he pours beer. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. This picture is incredibly haunting, and I agree with you. The melancholy of the man is palpable. And I'm wondering if the structure behind him is the structure that was moved to Kasama. It's that building.
I hadn't thought about that, but yes, I think you're right.
It looks very familiar. So, so when we can travel to Japan again, and one heads north of Tokyo to the ceramic-rich area of Kasama in Ibaragi and the Tochigi area to visit Mashiko, you must go visit this building, because when I saw it many years ago, a memorable visit, it palpably still retains his spirit. Thank you, Louise. My next question will be for Kuroda Kusaomi. Kuroda-san has been involved in the field of modern and contemporary Japanese ceramics for over 40 years. He is the managing director and president of Kuroda Toen Company, and which is the foremost dealer in this field in Japan, which is now in its third generation of leadership. In addition to planning and producing countless exhibitions centered around modern and contemporary Japanese ceramic artists, he has also authored numerous magazine articles and books on the topic of Japanese ceramic art. His books include Exploring the Charm of Bizenware, 125 Contemporary Japanese Potters, and, relevant for today, What I Learned from Uncle Rosanjin, among many others. Currently, he is a part-time lecturer at Okinawa Prefectural University of the Arts, and also lectures for travel companies as well. So, Kuroda-san, I have my first question for you, please. Rosanjin may be a legendary figure for all of us here tonight, but I understand that you personally remember him and witnessed the close personal relationship he enjoyed with your family, particularly your father, Kuroda Ryoji, who was Rosanjin's dealer during his lifetime. Can you talk a bit about your father and this vital relationship with Rosanjin? How did it lead to acquiring the site for Urokean, the location of your Kyobashi Gallery in Tokyo? We'll all be interested to hear this. Thank you.
ロサンジン芸術の出発点は書道でございます。1934年にロサンジンは星ヶ丘茶寮で修士養血という書道の講義をしたときに、父は調香師に行ったときが初対面でございました。ロサンジンの書の見どころなどについて語られ、人に習うのでなく、良い書を余計見て、目で習うこと。書は指でなくてはならない。価値がないと力説したわけです。その後、ロサンジンは料理屋を辞めまして、陶芸に力を入れるようになります。父も独立しまして、陶器店を日本橋に開業いたします。そんなことから、2人は大変意気投合して、ロサンジン邸の前の上り窯があるんですけれども、その向かい側に住むようになります。旅行など、窯元などにも一緒に行き、そういうことが多くなりました。私は、ロサンジンのところに子供の頃よく遊びに行きました。 そんな思い出もあり、由緒あるこの地にご縁をいただいて、ロサンジン作品を主としたロケ案を開展させていただいたのであります。
Kuroda-san, it's wonderful to hear from someone who's with us today, someone who actually met the man and knew the man as a little boy. None of us had that luxury of being there. And obviously your family has learned so much and gained so much by that close personal relationship with this enigmatic figure. Thank you. You mentioned earlier that Rosanjin was not born to a family of potters and that he began his career as a calligrapher and carver. And we just heard from Kuroda-san the importance of food to Rosanjin's artistic viewpoint. How then did Rosanjin came to be known as a ceramic artist without having the traditional training or background? And how were Rosanjin's ceramics produced? And what role did the other artists that we have called, quote unquote, his rivals, you and I, in this exhibition, and what roles did they play in this complicated process? And you are muted.
Just saw that. Thank you, Joan. I'm not sure I'm going to answer all of the components of that question, which is complex in itself. Earlier, I described Rosanjin as an impresario. And one thing I meant by that was how, as a prolific producer of ceramics, nonetheless, he was not a studio potter in the sense that he had full personal responsibility for managing his clay, his glazes, his shaping, and his firing. Instead, Rosanjin, in his Kitakamakura compound, drew around him a body of skilled craftsmen who could help him realize his vision. And I believe that the wonderful image that Kuroda-san just showed us is one view of that team of workers. You'll notice that the man sitting next to Rosanjin had a lot of clay on the bottom of his trousers. He probably had just run out from the workshop to pose for this image. Next, please. And next after that. But there was a deep precedent in Japan for the way Rosanjin worked with a team of skilled associates. And perhaps the most famous example of this is the potter Nonomura Ninsei, who worked in Kyoto for the third quarter of the 17th century. If you say Ninsei, the kind of pottery that comes to mind is this lavishly decorated jar with beautiful painting done in overglaze enamels. But Ninsei himself was a master of throwing. And his genius was that he drew around him from the painting workshops in Kyoto the people who could exercise his vision of decoration on the surface of his pots. Next, please. So for example, here we have in the center, one of my all-time favorite Japanese ceramics, a bowl that perhaps Ninsei himself threw. Certainly it was thrown to Ninsei's sense of form, but through the work of the artists, the trained painters that Ninsei brought into his workshop, it was decorated in this amazing way with glaze and then with overglaze enamels, including gold enamel, and made it indeed worthy of being named an important cultural property. So Ninsei's genius was that he used a team of artists to create his Ninsei brand. Rosanjin followed this pattern, but in Rosanjin's case, he was the decorator for the pieces that were thrown, glazed, and fired by the skilled specialists that he assembled in Kitakamakura. And here in this wonderful image, we see some of those specialists. I believe these are people who were charged with firing his kilns. You can see that this is the start of a firing. The coals are glowing. Just to the left of Isamu Noguchi and his wife Yamaguchi Yoshiko, who are standing behind Rosanjin. Again, I'm drawn to Rosanjin's creation of his image. Here he is, his workers are dressed to work. He's dressed in a Chinese silk robe with a glass of beer in his hand, ready to enjoy the process, to oversee it, and to watch for the outcome. Next, please. Rosanjin went on a visit with Noguchi in May 1952 to the Kaneshige Tōyō workshop in Bizen, where it is noted that he managed to supervise the production of some 800 ceramics. You see Kaneshige Tōyō and his wife on the right. I think of them almost watching in awe to think about how this was going to fill up their kiln completely. And Rosanjin, elegantly dressed, sitting not at the wheel himself, but opposite, next please, opposite the worker who was actually throwing on the wheel, making the shapes that he was ordering. And then Rosanjin, with his French cuffs and his neat trousers and his suspenders and his alligator leather watch, was adding the finishing touches to these pieces that he imagined as conveying a certain sense of historic Bizen and his own modern take on Bizen. Next, please. Rosanjin's array of ceramics, the wide world of ceramics that he drew into his own work, represents the evolution of Japanese interest in types of ceramics over the first half of the 20th century. His earliest work echoed Chinese blue and white porcelain or Chinese enamel decorated porcelain, at the same time that in London, the Oriental Ceramic Society was starting with its members thrilled by historical Japanese or Chinese porcelain. In the late 1920s, Rosanjin became personally acquainted with Korean ceramics through travels to Korea, visits to kiln sites. And then by 1930, he was also deeply interested in the historical ceramics of Japan, notably here, the oribe ware made in Mino. Next, please. His earliest exposure to ceramic production was a period of time spent with the Ishikawa Prefecture potter Suda Seika, who was skilled at replicating Chinese decorating techniques, whether overglazed enamels on the left or blue and white underglazed cobalt decoration on the right. And then subsequently, next, please. He also became acquainted early on with the Kyoto potter Miyanaga Tozan, who was famous for his skill at Chinese glazes, including celadon glaze, as it appears on this incense burner. And Rosanjin drew on his experiences in these workshops and others to understand how he should assemble a team of highly skilled specialists to realize the visions he had for his own ceramics. Next, please. Drawing on the workers who were discovering for themselves how to recreate Japanese ceramics of the 16th and 17th century, he worked for a while with Arakawa Toyozō, who mastered the arts of the glazes of the Mino kilns, including Shino glaze, as you see here, and helped Rosanjin build a kiln that enabled Rosanjin, in turn, to fire Mino-style wares with his own distinctive decoration. And next, please, as we just mentioned, he also invited Kaneshige Tōyō from Bizen to build a Bizen-style kiln that would enable Rosanjin to fire unglazed pieces to capture the ash and the varied colorations that come from wood firing, as you see on the Kaneshige piece here, and also on the Rosanjin base. Next, please. So Rosanjin, in each case, worked closely with the potters who were in his employ and discussed the shapes he wanted, the sizes he wanted, the quantity he wanted, and then in each case, carefully added the finishing touches. So you see here not a picture of Rosanjin throwing at the wheel, but sitting opposite a potter whose shoulder you see, who's helping him carefully, delicately finish the rim of a Song Dynasty Celadon style bowl in this case. Rosanjin, in that sense, enacted a kind of dream for the urban patrons who came to visit him in Kitakamakura. He dressed, his patrons dressed like this to go to their offices in Tokyo. Rosanjin wore his beautiful jacket and his sweater and his watch to spend time in his workshop with his workers, putting the finishing touches on the ceramics that he was imagining and leading into existence. So next, please. Some of the clever ploys that Rosanjin employed for helping to create this huge number of ceramics involved using plaster molds from a shigaraki jar that became the model, produced the model, the blank model for this very important jar in Joan's exhibition. But as you can see, glazed in a totally different fashion from the shigaraki jar that was its prototype. On other occasions, he used the model or the plaster mold of the shigaraki jar to make his own style shigaraki ware. And he also used molded forms to make pieces that hark back to Tang Dynasty China. Next, please. But I come back to the sense of Rosanjin as, above all, if we're thinking of his own skills, his skills as a painter, perhaps a painter who never realized his true ambition, but a painter and a calligrapher. And I think it's the marks that Rosanjin left on the ceramics that he created in collaboration with his workshop assistants, the marks of the skilled brush that make Rosanjin's recreations of the 16th and 17th century style ceramics, which were being made by many ceramic artists at his time, make them stand out for the painterly quality of them above all, and the imagination of how food could be served on these wonderful paintings preserved in clay. Thank you.
That was amazing, Louise, how much you compressed what could be a whole symposium into the answer to one question. Terrific, and of course, insightful. I would like to offer my next question to Meghen Jones for her first question. Meghen is currently the Associate Professor of Art History at the New York State College of Ceramics of Alfred University, where she teaches courses on East Asian material and visual culture and global ceramics history. Trained in ceramics craft design at Musashino Art University in Tokyo, she received her PhD in the history of art and architecture from Boston University with a dissertation on the modern ceramist Tomimoto Kenkichi. Her publications related to Rosanjin include Ceramics and Modernity in Japan, co-edited with Louise Cort, and the article Hamada Shoji, Kitaōji Rosanjin, and the reception of Japanese pottery in the early Cold War United States. in Design and Culture of a few years ago. She is currently curating an exhibition on the idiom of the tea bowl in global perspective for the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum, and we look forward to that. So Meghen, my first question to you. The post-war era of the 1940s and 50s was a critical period for the understanding of Japan by an American audience, both politically and culturally. Can you talk about how modern Japanese ceramics were received in the United States in those early post-war years? And how was Rosanjin's work perceived and understood in that context?
Sure. Thank you, Joan. That's, I think, a really important question and a big one. So I'll just touch on a few points. I think we can consider this complex context in several ways. So first, for the American general public, when they thought of Japanese ceramics at this time in the 40s and 50s, what were they thinking? And I think it's important to note that in the background, since the 1930s, Japan was blamed for taking over the American ceramics industry. In 1937, as we see in the image on the left, American pottery workers took to the streets to protest. We see crates of Japanese pots burning on the left. And in 1949, the American Vitrified China Association went to Congress asking for aid. They were protesting the fact that wages in the US were so high compared to other countries, and the American ceramics industry, most notably in East Liverpool, Ohio, was at the risk of dying. So when Rosanjin and other Japanese ceramic artists come to the US in the 1950s, it's striking, I think, that their work was perceived as quite anti-industrial, to the extent that the word primitive was sometimes used to describe it. Next slide, please. And another context in this period that's important is exhibitions and efforts by curators to educate the American public during this critically important period in US-Japan relations. So Japanese Pottery Old and New was the first American post-war exhibition featuring ceramics by 24 modern Japanese artists alongside historical Japanese and Korean ceramics, more than 250 pieces total at the Detroit Institute of Arts. James Plummer, the renowned University of Michigan professor of Asian art, was curator. And the political context here is that he had recently been inspector for the Arts and Monuments Division of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers in Japan. And in curating this exhibition, he credited General Douglas MacArthur for facilitating the inclusion of so many modern pieces. So I think this bridging of the old with the new, showing the essential beauty, as this exhibition called it, of Japanese ceramics, really primed American viewers for seeing ceramic art by Rosanjin and others as timeless works of art. Next slide, please. And then we can't forget the important context of American ceramic artists who in the 1950s were utterly transformed in a new wave of Japanism. Hamada Shoji, Kaneshige Tōyō, Katō Tokurō, and Rosanjin were all key interlocutors. But I think Hamada and Rosanjin ultimately exerted a more widespread effect, at least in publications and in American ceramic education writ large. So here we see Hamada giving a demo in California. This was the year before Rosanjin came to the US. And Hamada deeply impressed American potters with the beauty of anachronistic processes, like turning a potter's wheel with a stick. This was a revelation to American ceramic artists witnessing this sort of demonstration. The notion of allowing imperfection in pots and seeing it as a positive had a huge ripple effect on later American ceramic art. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Oops. Thank you, Meghen. It's a great photo there, and lots of food for thought for us to think about the impact, vice versa, of Japan upon America, and then, of course, later America upon Japan. I'd like to turn to Joan Cummins to bring this conversation sort of into, even further into America. Joan has served as the Lisa and Bernard Seltz Senior Curator of Asian Art at the Brooklyn Museum since 2007. She is currently engaged in a complete reinstallation of the Asian galleries at the Brooklyn Museum, with galleries for Japanese, Chinese, Korean art completed and additional spaces scheduled to open gradually over the next 2 years. Prior to her arrival at Brooklyn, she served as the Assistant Curator of Indian, Southeast Asian, and Himalayan art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She is a specialist in South Asian art, having received her doctorate in that field from Columbia University. But I should add that in her role as Asian art generalist, Joan has developed a deep understanding of the field of Japanese art, most profoundly. So I'm very happy to have her as part of the discussion today. And so my first question to you, Joan, is that Rosanjin was very fortunate in his selection of friends and acquaintances that he made at various points in his life. A key figure was Sidney Cardozo, who played a major role in the understanding and appreciation of Japanese ceramics in the West. What role did Sidney Cardozo play in bringing Rosanjin's works to the attention of the West?
Thank you, Joan. Great. Let me just begin by saying I'm a little sheepish and kind of humble about joining you here tonight and talking about the role played by Sidney Cardozo, because I am, as Joan mentioned, a kind of late arrival in this field. And I never actually met Sidney Cardozo, whereas there are people in the audience who did know him. And I am, however, the current keeper of the Brooklyn Museum's collection of great objects by Rosanjin, several of which were in Sidney's collection at one time. Sidney Cardozo was a New York journalist who moved to Tokyo in 1951 to write for the Stars and Stripes. He lived in Tokyo for almost the rest of his life, and after becoming a collector of ceramics by living masters, he became one of the most vocal non-Japanese proponents for their work. Cardozo became a good friend of Rosanjin's, and you can see the two of them together in this photo on the left, in the last 8 years of the artist's life. He was initially welcomed almost by accident into Rosanjin's circle because he mentioned that he had a mutual acquaintance with Isamu Noguchi, and immediately Rosanjin took that as a sign that he ought to sort of welcome him into the circle. By the time Cardozo met Rosanjin, the artist was already famous and showing in Europe, although he had not yet had his show at MOMA. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. So Sidney Cardozo wrote essentially 2 books on Rosanjin, one of them being the catalog for the 1972 Japan House show, which is barely visible. It has a white cover. It's the second one here on the screen. And the second being a monograph published by Kodansha in 1987 that was re-released with a slightly different title and slightly different contents later, which is the book that I'm showing you at the end. The first book I'm showing here was the catalog for an exhibition in Tokyo that featured a number of Sidney's pieces. He was one of 3 American collectors that were featured in this exhibition at the Tokyo National Museum. Oh, I'm calling it the Tokyo National Museum. No, it was actually the Tokyo National Museum of Modern Art. I believe he was actually a major consultant and possibly even helped write the essay. What strikes me most about these books is that Cardozo barely writes about the objects at all. The books are full of biographical information about the artist and many anecdotes capturing his larger-than-life personality. The later book includes a large selection of Rosanjin's own writings about various topics. These books served to promote the artist as a sort of Picasso of Japan. And indeed, there is a wonderful anecdote about Rosanjin's actual meeting with Picasso. But they do very little to help the uninitiated connoisseur understand what's so great about the ceramics illustrated, nor do they explain the historical contexts for the many types of wares that Rosanjin made over the course of his career. But from what I understand, Cardozo was most influential in person, in situations where you could pass time in the presence of actual ceramics, handling them and comparing them. His personal collection was full of important pieces, and that collection was considered important in Japan. It was not just the gleanings of some dabbling expat. However, his expat status made him a much easier entry point for English-speaking visitors. Many people cite their visits to his ceramic-filled home as a seminal learning experience, the beginning of their appreciation for modern ceramics, or even the beginning of their addiction to ceramic collecting. He welcomed scholars, curators, and museum patron groups, took them around to the latest gallery shows, advised them about what kiln sites to visit, made introductions to artists, which was very important, and also accompanied people to restaurants known for serving on fine ceramics. Cardozo became the center for a very convivial group of enthusiasts, for a growing community who were learning together. And I will talk more about that community later when I talk about my museum in particular. Obviously, Cardozo was not solely responsible for bringing appreciation of Japanese contemporary ceramics to the United States. The MOMA Rosanjin show in 1954 was not his doing. And there were people stateside who were spreading the word, most notably Fred Bakeland and a variety of dealers and private collectors. By 1972, when Cardozo organized the Rosanjin show at Japan House, it was possible to put together the whole show from American private collections, with a healthy sprinkling from his own collection, because frankly, he had some of the best examples. Sidney Cardozo died in 2002. By that point, modern and contemporary ceramics were a standard area of collecting for any museum with Japanese art. I hope that people who actually knew him will chime in with memories or contributions in the comments.
Thank you, Joan. It's great to get a sense of Sidney's profound contribution to a field that I am tiptoeing in his very large footsteps. And he certainly deserves all the focus today on his accomplishments and his legacy that we are all enjoying. My next question goes back to Meghen. And Meghen, can you talk about how the Rosanjin exhibition at MoMA and how the subsequent exhibition at Alfred came to be? Who attended these two shows and how was it received by the public? My understanding is also that there were a number of related events at that time, and our audience would surely like to hear what all these exhibitions promoted and now allowed Americans to understand what the Japanese were doing.
Okay, there's so many stories, and there were multiple stops on Rosanjin's tour of the United States in the spring of 1954 before he went to Europe. So I'll try to keep my comments brief. So let's start with MoMA, the Japan Society of New York, led by John D. Rockefeller III, who we see at the right of this photo, coordinated exhibitions and sales of Rosanjin's ceramics, including at MoMA, an exhibition, not a sale, where Rockefeller's wife, Blanchette, was a trustee. She had met Rosanjin in Japan in 1953. MoMA's archives revealed that 13 pieces were on display in their penthouse, and these were pieces in the styles of Shigaraki, Seto, Shino, and Bizen. There's an anecdote that's recorded about the Bizen pieces shortly before this opening. By the way, we see Rosanjin in the photo with his back to us and Blanchette to the right of him. Before the opening, Rosanjin viewed the cases and saw that the Bizet works looked dry. And so he insisted that the guard open up the cases so that they could have water placed on them to come alive, so to speak. We see one of the works that was shown on the right, a Shigaraki-style jar with a deliberately torn mouth. And this relates to examples that were shown previously tonight, but I think it's a wonderful example of Rosanjin, as he liked to say, reading the hearts of the ancients. Reading the hearts of the ancients is one way to describe his looking to the past. At MoMA and in the New York Times, we find that word primitive coming up. The label at MoMA in part read, an important aspect of Rosanjin's work is the studied cultivation of effects characteristic of primitive Japanese art. And the New York Times noted that his work was primitive in its irregularity. I note this because later discourse on Rosanjin in the US tended to include, certainly by 1972's exhibition, a much more nuanced, historically informed set of perspectives. And as I wrote about in my article for Design and Culture, I think there is something to be said about the political context of wartime propaganda being, as John Dower has argued, transformed into a new framing of Japan in light of the importance of Japan as an ally in the post-World War II period. Next slide, please. And quickly, just to note that 1954 was a huge year for Japan at MoMA. That summer, after Rosanjin's exhibition, the 16th to 17th century style Japanese house became a major attraction in the garden. And also that summer was the first exhibition at MoMA of abstract Japanese calligraphy. Next slide, please. So here we are looking down in the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains at Alfred University in southwestern New York State in the 1950s. So from New York City, Rosanjin took the overnight train to Alfred, accompanied by none other than Beata Gordon, whose name I'm sure many of you are familiar with due to her critical role in the writing of the Constitution in Japan in 1947, particularly its section on women's rights. Serve as his translator. And I think her diplomatic skills really came into play. There are some archival records suggesting stating outright, let me read this quote from a Japan Society letter, that Rosanjin, quote, had to be watched all the time lest he get into serious trouble. Okay, so just imagine Gordon and Rosanjin taking the train to Alfred, this center since 1900 of ceramic art and design and engineering education. Another famous story of this visit is that he insisted he needed beer at one point, prompting a faculty member to drive 20 miles to procure it for him, since Alfred at that time was a dry town. Next slide, please. And here we see the transcription of his speech at Alfred. I think first and foremost, he wanted to tell American audiences that ceramics is art. And we take this for granted today, but this was a running theme throughout his speech. And as we see here, he said that if a ceramic artist pays attention to pottery only and has no interest in other lines of fine art, he will be reduced to mere artisanship. And there we see Beata Gordon's name below. And Charles Harder was chairman of Alfred's Department of Design at the time, and he wrote that Rosanjin's visit was most valuable due to Gordon's gracious and efficient interpretation of, quote, some rather difficult material. And one wonders what he was referring to with that reference to difficult material. And here I think Charles Harder might have been referring to some potentially contentious points in this speech. And this transcript is in the archives at Alfred. But Rosanjin also conveyed in the speech that there were no real ceramic artists in Japan, that Japan was totally devoid of connoisseurs who could appreciate beauty, and that Americans were starting from scratch when it came to ceramic art. But on a positive note, he greatly complimented American audiences for appreciating Japanese art beyond just ukiyo-e. He expressed appreciation for their sensitivity to various forms of Japanese art. And Rosanjin predicted that in 100 years, magnificent works will be produced in the United States. Those are parts of his speech. Next slide, please. The only other records of his visit that remain at Alfred are his ceramic pieces. There are 8 pieces total in the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum collection, and they're closely related to others throughout American collections. So here we see a piece very close to its sibling in a way in MoMA. Next slide, please. And here are some of the pieces also in the Alfred collection. So he took the pieces to New York City, and the Japan Society facilitated these pieces being gifted to Alfred. And we see Bizen, Shigaraki, and Shino styles all channeled here, and all were tableware, of course, meant for the presentation of Japanese cuisine. But how did American students and faculty at Alfred understand these sorts of works? Next, please. So Rosanjin left a major mark on post-war American ceramics. The work on the left is the 8th piece in the Alfred collection. And the work on the right is by Robert Turner, who was a professor at Alfred for many years and was living in Alfred Station, was a studio potter at the time of Rosanjin's visit. So Turner recalls that he was very much affected by Rosanjin, that he associated Rosanjin's work with Zen, a sense of change and accepting change. He praised this vessel by Rosanjin for its formal elements, stating that he, quote, felt a distinct power in the raw fired surface and the abrupt meeting of the upper and lower shapes. It was expressive of geometry, of weight, and of gravity, of forces of nature as a significant determinant of form. So Turner's Déchet vase on the right, I think, conjures both the dramatic northeastern Arizona rock formations in Déchet and Rosanjin's vessel. So this kind of formalism and hybridity would, I think, very much come to define much post-war American studio ceramic art. There's a lot to talk about.
We're just
Many
getting
stories.
Thank you,
Meghen.
Meghen.
I'll end there.
That's terrific. And for those of you who want to download my catalog, you will see a Kaneshige Tōyō in the furuta shape of the Rosanjin piece there that is the perfect complement to this narrative that we're looking at. And I also wanted to say I actually knew Beata Gordon, and I remember her telling me stories of how Munakata came to live with her father in St. Louis, and what a difficult, bigger than life character he was. So I think that early training on how to manage, if you will, a strong-minded Japanese superstar in his related field was ingrained in her very early. So she was the perfect person for Rosanjin. Next, I would like to call upon my last question for Joan. Joan, can you talk about, and you intimated we were going to ask this question, the role played by and the legacy left by Sidney, specifically for the Brooklyn Museum? And can you show us some of these great treasures that I know your lights are off right now, that hopefully one day we will be able to see back on view in your new Japanese, beautiful new Japanese galleries?
Right. Thank you very much for that question, Joan. And many of you know that the Brooklyn Museum embraced modern Japanese ceramics pretty early. There was a nexus of interested parties in and around the museum that made that happen. The museum had been collecting Japanese art for years, as had many, but we were collecting Mingei before it was called Mingei, thanks to the efforts of ethnographer Stuart Cullen. Actually, one of our first acquisitions by a living ceramicist was a Kawai Kanjiro bowl, apparently given to our curator, Lawrence Roberts, by the artist in the summer of 1940. But it was in the 1970s that things really started happening at Brooklyn. First, because curator Lois Katz was friends with collectors Fred and Joan Bakeland. Fred and Joan had met Sidney Cardozo on their honeymoon in Japan in 1969. Curators Bob Mose and Amy Poster took over, holding multiple small and large exhibitions of Japanese ceramics, old and new, over the course of the 1970s and 80s. Cardozo came to New York once a year to see family and usually included a visit to Brooklyn's storerooms, where he, together with curators and various friends, would handle the ceramics and talk about their various qualities. The Brooklyn curators also managed to make it to Japan about once a year, and often brought their friends who were new to the field and excited by how beautiful and, frankly, how cheap the ceramics were.
Let's go. Okay.
As Amy Poster and I were talking about that period in time, she pointed out that the 1970s were a moment, and I quote, when curators and collectors tended to see contemporary ceramics, especially works by Rosanjin, in relation to traditional ceramics, unquote. And indeed, when we see the Rosanjin pieces collected by Brooklyn, they run the gamut of traditional wares. Cardozo made his first gift to the Brooklyn Museum in 1976 with this really wonderful bowl with grape design by Rosanjin that had been in both the Tokyo National Museum of Modern Art show and the Japan House show. You can see that it was given in memory of his mother. And I think it was a special bowl to him, and we feel very honored that he donated it to us. The bowl highlights Rosanjin's skill with a brush, as well as his understanding of historic precedents. It draws on multiple influences, some of which have already been discussed tonight. It draws on Rinpa traditions, the sort of Korin and Kenzan collaborations, plus some others like Korean underglazed brown decorated wares of the 18th century, like this magnificent grape jar over on the right. And Ninami Dohachi and related Kyoto ceramicists' work from the 19th century. When the Japan Gallery at Brooklyn reopens in July, the grape bowl will be out on view, along with the gourd-shaped Ninami Dohachi bowl, which is also in our collection. And they'll be together in a case with some Rinpa-inspired ceramics. Unfortunately, the other two pieces are not ours. The Cardozo also donated this attractive shigaraki jar by Rosanjin, and he deposited a large number of ceramics with the museum for safekeeping, including this lovely oribe fan-shaped dish, which will also be on view with other oribe wares when we reopen. Most of the Rosanjin pieces he had on loan to Brooklyn were removed and sold. But we were fortunate that we and some of our supporters were able to buy pieces from his collection. One of the pieces that we have from his collection is an inscribed porcelain lampstand that was in the Japan House show, but for which I don't have a good photo. So I haven't included it here. He also gave us many, many works by other living artists. But beyond his gifts, his influence is very much felt in the museum's later collecting of Japanese contemporary ceramics, because he helped educate and acclimate several of our friends who went on to donate major pieces to the collection. And it wasn't just traditional style wares. He was instrumental in the acquisition of our big Fukami sculpture in 1994. Sidney was not the only donor who gave us great Rosanjins. There are two here. I'm showing you two nice pieces donated by the great scholar of historic Japanese ceramics, Hugo Munsterberg. The lovely little brazier was acquired by Munster Berg directly from the artist at his studio in 1956. And the dish is a pretty classic Rosanjin piece. Really, we should be showing it at a different angle. Everyone should tip their head to one side or the other. But we also have great Rosanjin gifts that came in from Fred and Joan Bakeland, Bernice and Robert Dickies, Carol and John Lydon, Sandra and Rand Castile, and Peggy and Roger Gary. So for more than 2 decades, Brooklyn was a center of unusual activity in the field of modern and contemporary ceramics. We never had much money. We really did not purchase very many objects at all, but thanks to the generosity and guidance of people like Sidney Cardozo, and thanks to the energetic efforts of my predecessors, there was a very active group of friends and supporters who shared their finds with the museum. Other museums have since caught up with Brooklyn, and in the area of contemporary ceramics, they have in some cases surpassed us. But I feel very fortunate that my predecessors had the foresight and good advice to bring in this material while it was still accessible.
Thank you, Joan. Is it possible that Brooklyn has the greatest holdings of Rosanjin's work in the United States? Louise might know the answer to that, but it seems like you guys have a lot.
Yeah, we have, I think, 10, 12
Wonderful
pieces. And all different
Yes.
wares.
Wonderful. You can do a mini show.
Good.
For our last question, I would like to return to Kuroda-san. Hopefully he's awake at this early hour and he's patiently waiting. And my question to him is, what is it about Rosanjin's work that has been and remains so compelling for a broad Japanese audience? Prices have remained strong since his death. And even just last week, I understand that an important painting by him of a bowl of grapes sold for over $140,000. Why are so many Japanese museums so focused on his work? And I believe there's even a brand new museum dedicated to Rosanjin, and I'd like to hear about that as well. Kuroda-san, please.
はい。ロサンジンには自然美霊産っていうのがあります。自然は芸術の極致、美の最高であるという言葉を残しておりますけれども、ロサンジン芸術の根幹に自然美があり、総合芸術家として何をやらせても一流だったわけです。すべてに創意工夫がされております。ひたすら自然美を捉えながら、繊細な心と大胆な技で唯一無二の芸術作品を作り出している。自然美を本当の意味で理解した純粋な芸術家で切れ味の良い表現には起因があります。例えば草の線一本でも細い線ですね。自然の香りを生かすためにきめ細かな配慮がしかもとっさになされているわけです。特に陶芸に関しては1955年渡米の翌年になりますけれども、伝統的な織部の技法で人間国宝に推挙されます。ロサンジンはこれを断りました。また翌年もぜひにと言われたんですけれども、それも断ったわけですけれども、美に対して妥協しない真の芸術を追い求めるために拒否した孤高の芸術家と言えるでしょう。ロサンジンの言葉に、器は料理の着物、料理と器は車の両輪であるということを言っております。ロサンジンの器は料理を生かして引き立てます。こんなことで、料理屋さん だけでなく、コレクターにもお使いになって楽しまれている方が多いわけです。料理を盛り付ける楽しさ、器との調和を、食の素晴らしさ、食材を生かすおもてなしの心が宿っているからだと思います。使われるほどに魯山人作品への興味が、感動が次々に湧いてくる、そういう、楽しい作品であります。毎年のように多くの美術館で魯山人展が、日本では開催されていますけれども、日本の美術家、芸術家の中で、その美術館に入館する方の数がダントツに多い。魯山人は感動がものを作らせると物事にこだわらず自由奔放な作品はものを飽きさせない、凄みみたいなものがあるからだと思います。として島根県にある足立美術館が昨年の春、開館50周年でオープンしました。数は400点ほどの所蔵がございますけれども、良い作品が結構展示されております。でもう一つ、広島の宮島北大路魯山人美術館っていうのが、昨年の3月にオープンいたしました。
Thank you. I guess we all need to get on a plane and go head off to Japan to see these new museums that have opened in the year and a half that none of us have been able to go there. Thank you, Kuroda-san, for giving us that link to the past that no one else in this event can do in a way that is palpable and exciting. Thank you. And I just wanted to end with this slide with the small painting that just sold for $140,000 by Rosanjin, paired with its predecessor, if you will, that is in Brooklyn. Joan, I don't think you bought the painting, but it would be nice one day to put them together, I think. At least we can do so on the screen. So thank you, panelists, for a really, I think, incredibly informative look into one of the first maybe media superstar in Japan, maybe one of the first celebrity chefs of all time, and a look into the world of Japanese promotion, if you will. I welcome anyone to come visit the show. We're going to try and keep it up through April. We are open by appointment. Hopefully you can come and see these marvelous works in person. Tomorrow, as I mentioned before, is the kickoff for Asia Week. Mike Hearn will be presenting, Mike Hearn from the Met will be presenting along with many of our collaborators for Asia Week at 5 o'clock, and you can register for that online with Asia Week. And you can download our catalog with wonderful essays. I'm looking to actually print it. I think the book is too important to just leave to a virtual format, but for the moment it's available off our website. And hopefully we will also document the exhibition by doing a video tour that we'll try and get up on the site shortly. So thank you all for hanging in there tonight. We did finish close to on time. And most especially to our panelists who worked so hard to condense so much information and so many beautiful images into simply 90 minutes. So have a good evening, everyone. Stay healthy, get vaccinated, and hope to see you in person soon or maybe in the near future. Good night.